So, what is this Talmud that we mentioned last time? We're talking about Judaism now. We're really getting into Judaism proper, um, and it's going to bring us back to the question of what does it mean to be Jewish? Because after all, is this a religion? Is this an ethnicity? What is it? Um, but the Talmud is clearly, from a historical perspective, a product of the exile and the dispersion, and it is an effort to figure out how to use the laws that deal so much with a sacrificial system and a temple system that no longer exist. So it's been said, and this is from a Jewish perspective, traditional Judaism as a religion is based not only upon the Hebrew Bible, but upon the Jewish rabbinic tradition. And the foundation of the Jewish rabbinic tradition is the Talmud. So this is important to keep in mind. And while there are two kind of versions early on of the Talmud, the Jerusalem one and the Babylonian one, it's the Babylonian one that takes prominence, because it's there that it can develop with the least outside interference or concern for what might be a backlash to what it might say. So this is because Jerusalem is obviously under Roman rule, and all the other communities of Jews that are out there, I mean, you see them spreading out up until about 500 AD. They're in Roman-controlled regions, and so this is problematic. This is difficult because from the Roman perspective, both before it becomes Christian and after, these Jews have been troublemakers long enough. And once the Roman Empire embraces kind of officially on some level Christianity, the Jews are seen as kind of rebelling against God, as responsible for the death of Jesus. And oftentimes what is said in the Talmud about Jesus doesn't do them any favors. So you don't find as many negative things about Jesus in the Jerusalem Talmud as you do in the Babylonian Talmud, because that's not influenced by living among Romans and among very many Christians. Again, also, it's important to note that the most conservative of Jews, rabbinic Jews, will tell you that the roots of the Talmud are in the time of the Great Assembly. And this is because it's this collection of works, the Torah, the Tanakh, Mishnah, Talmud, Gemara, Midrash. These terms all apply to kind of the Talmud, and some of them overlap, and we'll explain what these are, but they come from like I said, historically from after the destruction of the temple, but the conservative and most traditional of rabbinic Jews will say that when God gave the law, the Torah is the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. When God gave that to Moses, he wrote that down, but that he also gave the Mishnah, the oral Torah. And Moses didn't write that down. Instead, Moses taught that to Joshua. And Joshua, before he died, taught it to the elders. And the elders taught it to the prophets. And the prophets passed it down through Ezra to the Great Assembly. And then the Great Assembly decided to write down the Mishnah, the oral Torah. And so the Talmud is this collection of things. And what it is, so Tanakh, if you see there, that's the acronym for the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Torah being those first 5 books, the law, the books of Moses. The N stands for Navi, which means prophets. So you have what they call the former prophets and the latter prophets. And the former prophets, in most Christian Bibles, they're assumed to be historical books. They're Judges, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. These books are somewhat, they tell the story of Israel and their kings, but there's always prophets coming in and out of those stories. So that's considered the former prophets. The latter prophets, also part of the Navaim. They are books that are named after prophets. That the whole book is an extended list of, an extended kind of writing of prophetic scrolls. So like the book of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Amos, Micah, Joel. These are prophets. So they're called the latter prophets because they happen either just before the exile into Babylon or while in Babylon. And then the Ketuvim, the K stands for Ketuvim, that's the wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job. These are those other writings. This is really what it means is writings. So the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures is the Tanakh. And so the Tanakh, like we said, especially in the Torah, has all these rules about sacrifice and priesthood and temple that doesn't exist anymore. So what do you do with that? Well, they say that we have these Mishnah as well. We have this oral law. It came from Moses to Joshua, to the elders, down to the elders at the Great Assembly, and they finally wrote it down. So we're going to apply the Mishnah to the Tanakh, to the Torah, and the Gemara. The Gemara are these kind of commentaries by famous rabbis, and this is added to over time. So the Gemara comment on the Mishnah and the Tanakh. And so you have this whole structure that we'll look at in just a minute of writings surrounding one another, explaining each other, and that is in a book called the Talmud. Now, if there's a certain teaching based on the Mishnahs and the Gemara, based on the teachings of various different rabbis, then that teaching, that little subset of teaching, is called a midrash. A midrash just means a teaching. So the midrash are rooted in the way the Gemara and the Mishnah explain the Torah. So this is something of how the Talmud looks, and I'll pull up there. It's Hebrew goes from right to left. So this is a picture of a page from the Talmud, and you have different parts. So you'll have you'll have like a biblical verse passage, a few verses, and then around it you'll have some of the Mishnah, the oral laws, and then around that you'll have Gemara, and beside that you'll have later Gemara or commentaries and various midrashim that can be taught easily from the Talmud that explain the different laws and the different sacrificial system ideas and how they apply to daily life. So this is kind of a way that it would, this kind of color codes what you would have, right? So you have various levels of writings in the Talmud, and so you have these Mishnah that are explaining verses from the Scripture. You have these old Babylonian commentaries, and then you have surrounding commentaries from other famous rabbis and markings of other key scriptural quotations. So it's a whole system of study on each page. It's a conversation on each page of the Talmud. So that's what we see is this kind of ongoing conversation. And it's not, the ethics can't just be built on the Torah itself. It's built around the Talmud and its contents. So this is kind of the famous saying, Moses received the Torah from Sinai and conveyed it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. So that's this idea, that Great Assembly that we saw in the timeline. They codified and wrote down these oral teachings. What about rabbis, right? So there are two famous rabbinic schools that affect modern Judaism tremendously, Hillel and Shammai. And Hillel is the most popular. It's the most widely accepted. And so why does the law follow the rulings of the school of Hillel? The Talmud explains that the disciples of Hillel were gentle and modest and studied their own opinions and the opinions of other schools and humbly mentioned the words of the other school before their own. So it's this idea of reasoning together. The scriptures themselves of the Talmud kind of show this discursive approach. not an authoritative declarative approach, and so it's the commentaries of Hillel school that are most valued for that reason, because they reflect the very structure of the Talmud in the way they address issues.